Chapter 1. The Dawn of a Queen, Cleopatra's Early Years. Long before her name echoed through the annals of history, before the world knew her as the last pharaoh of Egypt, a baby girl was born into privilege, destiny, and danger. In the bustling, sun-drenched city of Alexandria, a vibrant cultural hub nestled along the Mediterranean coast, a royal child entered the world. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator. Though her birth may have seemed like just another royal event in the Ptolemaic court, it marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived. Cleopatra was not merely born into power. She was born into a legacy of ambition, intellect, and survival. Her family, the Ptolemies, had ruled Egypt for generations, yet they were not Egyptians by blood. They were Macedonian Greeks, descended from Ptolemy the First Soter, a trusted general of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's empire fractured, Ptolemy seized Egypt and declared himself pharaoh, founding a Greek dynasty in the land of the Nile. Thus, Cleopatra's lineage was one of conquest and foreign rule, blending Greek heritage with Egyptian authority. But Cleopatra would be the first of her dynasty to bridge that cultural divide in a way no ruler before her dared. From the moment she could walk through the marbled halls of the palace, Cleopatra's world was one of luxury and tension. She grew up in immense wealth, surrounded by golden statues, fragrant gardens, and endless scrolls of knowledge stored in the legendary Library of Alexandria. Her days were filled with learning, but also with watching, observing the treacherous games of power that unfolded within her own family, because life inside the royal court was far from safe. In this glittering world of jewels and politics, enemies often came dressed as kin. Brothers turned against sisters, mothers were sidelined, and alliances could shift with a single whispered rumor. The Ptolemies were known for keeping power within the family, sometimes literally, through sibling marriages, and more darkly through betrayal and bloodshed. To survive here required more than royal blood. It required cunning. Even as a child, Cleopatra showed signs of something rare, fierce intelligence mixed with natural charisma. While most women of her time, even those of noble birth, received little formal education, Cleopatra was educated like a philosopher king. She studied Greek poetry, Egyptian myths, Roman politics, and ancient philosophies. And tutors taught her mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. But perhaps most remarkably, she became a master of language. Ancient sources claim she spoke at least 7 languages fluently, including Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Aramaic, and Hebrew. This skill alone set her apart. She was the only Ptolemaic ruler who bothered to learn the language of the Egyptian people. To her subjects, this was not a minor gesture. It was revolutionary. While many viewed her as a Greek princess, Cleopatra began to reshape her identity early on. She adopted Egyptian customs, worshiped native gods, and even presented herself as the earthly incarnation of the goddess Isis, a divine figure revered for her wisdom and power. In doing so, Cleopatra was not only claiming spiritual authority, but forging a deeper bond with her people. She wanted to be more than a ruler sitting atop a foreign throne. She wanted to be Egypt's queen, in heart, spirit, and soul. But even the most brilliant minds must contend with hardship. Cleopatra's early years were shadowed by uncertainty. Her father, King Ptolemy III, often called Aletus, the flute player, was an unpopular ruler. He was seen by many as weak and too dependent on Roman support. His political choices drained the kingdom's treasury and made enemies within the court and among the people. As civil unrest grew, threats to the royal family multiplied. Hotels, the family was forced into exile, fleeing their golden palaces for safety in foreign lands. Cleopatra saw all of this with young, watchful eyes. She learned not to take her status for granted. Power could be lost in a heartbeat. Loyalty could be bought or worse, faked. And survival often came down to timing, wit, and knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. By the time she was a teenager, Cleopatra had already begun preparing herself for what lay ahead. Unlike other royal girls content to live within the palace walls, Cleopatra studied foreign politics, the inner workings of the Roman Republic, and the fragile balance between Egypt's riches and Rome's growing hunger for control. She understood that Egypt's independence and her own future depended on her ability to lead not just with beauty, but with brilliance. She wasn't wrong. Her opportunity and her greatest challenge would soon arrive. Chapter 2, A Crown Divided, Cleopatra's Struggle for Power. The passing of a king is rarely a peaceful affair, and in Cleopatra's world, it was the beginning of a storm. When her father, Ptolemy III, died, he left behind more than a throne. He left behind a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. In his final will, likely crafted under the influence of Rome, he declared that his eldest daughter, Cleopatra, would co-rule Egypt, but not alone. She had to share power with her much younger brother, Ptolemy III, a boy of 10, barely old enough to understand the meaning of a crown, much less wear one. To outsiders, it may have seemed like an ordinary arrangement, a continuation of Ptolemaic tradition. Sibling rulers were not uncommon in their dynasty, and often they even married one another to consolidate power. But behind the marble columns of the Alexandrian palace, tension brewed. Cleopatra, now in her late teens, was no child. Well sums it up, morning show. She had been groomed for leadership, educated, shrewd, and aware of Egypt's precarious place between independence and Roman interference. Her brother, on the other hand, was surrounded by scheming courtiers and power-hungry advisors who saw in him the perfect puppet. And to them, Cleopatra's intelligence and ambition made her dangerous. At first, Cleopatra tried to make the arrangement work. She appeared alongside her brother in official proclamations, allowed his name to be used with hers on coinage and documents, and upheld the image of unity. But beneath the surface, she began taking control, meeting directly with envoys, issuing royal decrees on her own, and positioning herself as Egypt's true sovereign. This did not sit well with the men behind Ptolemy III. They moved quickly and quietly. Within a short time, Cleopatra was forced out of the palace. Her name was erased from official documents. Statues of her were removed from temples. The rightful queen of Egypt had become a fugitive in her own land. She fled Alexandria with a handful of loyal supporters. With no army, no city, and no throne, many would have surrendered to despair. But Cleopatra was not raised to crumble. In the scorching deserts of Syria and the surrounding regions, Cleopatra began to regroup. He sent messages to allies, plotted with mercenaries, and studied the movements of her enemies. She understood that brute force alone would not win her back the crown. She needed an ally, one powerful enough to tilt the scales of fate. And fate, it seems, answered. At that very moment, the mighty Roman general Julius Caesar had arrived in Egypt. He had come to settle Rome's interests in the region, debts owed, treaties in question, and civil unrest that threatened Rome's access to grain and riches. Caesar was already a legend across the Mediterranean, a military genius, a seasoned politician, and a man known for making and breaking kings. Cleopatra saw her moment. She knew that approaching Caesar openly was impossible. Her enemies watched every road and gate. So she devised a plan so daring it would be whispered about for centuries. Late one night, she had herself wrapped tightly in a carpet, not a symbolic gesture, but a literal one, and had her servant smuggle the bundle into the palace where Caesar was staying. When the carpet was unfurled before the Roman general, out tumbled Cleopatra herself, regal, poised, and it wasn't just the boldness of her entrance that captured Caesar's attention. It was her presence. Cleopatra spoke with clarity, with charm, with purpose. She presented her case not as a victim, but as a ruler wrong. While I was president, she spoke of her vision for Egypt, her understanding of Roman politics, and her desire for peace. Through power, not submission, Caesar, intrigued and impressed, agreed to mediate the conflict between Cleopatra and her brother. But mediation quickly turned into an alliance. Ptolemy XIII and his court panicked. What followed was not diplomacy, but war. The Alexandrian War erupted, a brutal clash between Caesar and Cleopatra's combined forces against those loyal to Ptolemy the 13th. Fires broke out in the city. Some say parts of the great library of Alexandria were destroyed in the chaos. In the end, Cleopatra's brother was defeated. And accounts say he drowned while trying to flee. What mattered more was this: Cleopatra was queen once again, not by inheritance, but by resolve. And yet she knew the battle was far from over. Egypt remained vulnerable. Rome's influence was growing stronger by the day. And while she now sat upon the throne, her future and that of her kingdom would depend on far more than a military victory. It would require strategy, diplomacy, and relationships as complex and perilous as any war. As Cleopatra looked out over the Nile from her palace balcony, she did not simply see the land she ruled. She saw what it could become, a nation not under Rome's heel, but standing beside it. To achieve that vision, she would have to play a game far more dangerous than politics. She would have to play with the heart-sabbers. Chapter 3, The Queen and the Conqueror, Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. With the dust of war barely settled and her brother defeated, Cleopatra reclaimed her throne, but not alone. Standing beside her in victory was the most powerful man in the Roman Republic, Julius Caesar. Their unlikely alliance, forged in ambition and solidified by strategy, would soon evolve into one of history's most talked about relationships, a blend of passion, politics, and power. For Cleopatra, Caesar was more than a foreign general. He was a bridge to survival and potentially to glory. For Caesar, Cleopatra was unlike any ruler he had encountered. She wasn't merely a beautiful monarch asking for protection. She was astute, eloquent, and already shaping Egypt's future with an authority that rivaled any Roman senator. In the months following the Alexandrian War, Cleopatra and Caesar spent long days in the opulent palaces of Alexandria. They discussed law, trade, philosophy, and the fate of their nations. It was said that she could speak to him in his native Latin, then turn to her advisors in Greek, and later converse with Egyptian priests in their sacred tongue, seamlessly and with complete command. Caesar, a man who prized intellect, was captivated, but their bond was not built solely on strategy. The romance blossomed amidst politics. They sailed down the Nile on a royal barge, lavishly adorned with gold and silk, drifting past temples and monuments that had stood since before Rome was even born. Cleopatra, with her deep knowledge of Egyptian lore and history, became not only a companion, but a guide, revealing to Caesar the soul of her kingdom. In this time of peace and pleasure, Cleopatra bore a son, Ptolemy V, affectionately called Caesarion, or Little Caesar. To Cleopatra, he was more than a child. He was a symbol, the union of two great civilizations, and possibly the future ruler of an empire stretching from the sands of Egypt to the hills of Rome. But outside the palace walls, whispers grew louder. In Rome, news of Caesar's closeness with the Egyptian queen stirred unrest. To the Roman elite, Cleopatra was a foreign influence, a manipulator, and even a threat. So she didn't behave like other women. She didn't shrink from power. She wielded it. And worst of all, she had captured the heart and attention of their most powerful leader. Despite the criticism, Caesar did not distance himself from Cleopatra. In fact, he invited her to Rome, and she came not in secrecy, but in spectacle. Cleopatra's arrival in Rome was a moment few would forget. She traveled with Caesarion and a retinue fit for a goddess, chariots plated in gold, exotic animals from the Nile, attendants dressed in shimmering silks. Rome, unaccustomed to such Eastern grandeur, watched in awe and suspicion. While in the city, Cleopatra resided in a grand villa provided by Caesar himself, just across the Tiber River from the Forum. She attended feasts and met influential senators, and her presence influenced Roman art and fashion. Some of them began copying her makeup and hairstyles. Others whispered that she was bewitching their men. But Cleopatra didn't come to Rome to entertain. She came to secure Egypt's position. And while Caesar never publicly named Caesarion as his heir, the implications of their bond were clear and dangerous. Behind the scenes, resentment brewed. Many in the Roman Senate already feared Caesar's growing power. He had declared himself dictator for life, making bold moves that strained the limits of the Republic. His relationship with Cleopatra only fanned the flames. Then came the knives. On a fateful day, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators, including men he once called allies. They struck swiftly, fatally, and without warning. As his blood stained the floor of the Roman Senate, so too did Cleopatra's hopes for a Roman-Egyptian alliance bleed away. News of Caesar's death reached Cleopatra like a thunderclap. In an instant, her world shifted. The man who had helped her secure the throne, who had fathered her son, and who had protected Egypt's sovereignty, was gone. In Rome, her position went from uncertain to perilous. Fearing for her life and the future of her son, Cleopatra made a swift, silent retreat. She returned to Egypt with Caesarion and her household, leaving behind the dangerous labyrinth of Roman politics. But she was not returning in defeat. Cleopatra may have lost her most powerful ally, but she had learned something vital, that Rome was both a partner and a predator. Egypt's survival would depend on choosing the right Roman at the right moment and on preparing for the day when Caesarion might stand, not just as a symbol of union, but as a ruler in his own right. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra returned to governance with renewed resolve. She stabilized Egypt's economy, restored temples, and strengthened her navy. And while she mourned Caesar privately, publicly she projected power. She ensured that Caesarion was raised not only as a prince, but as a future pharaoh, and perhaps more. The stage was being set for another chapter, one where Cleopatra would once again look toward Rome, not in grief, but in calculation. And this time, the name on her lips would not be Caesar. There would be Antony. Chapter 4, Empire of Passion, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. In the wake of Caesar's death, the Roman Republic staggered like a wounded beast. The vacuum left behind by the fallen dictator unleashed a storm of ambition, betrayal, and civil war. Though three powerful men emerged to claim control: Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir; Marcus Lepidus, a general and politician; and Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted ally and charismatic commander. As Rome fractured, Egypt watched. Cleopatra, now more seasoned and shrewd than ever, observed the turmoil from her throne in Alexandria. She knew that Egypt's survival, perhaps even its rebirth, would depend on aligning with the right Roman. And among the triumvirs, one name stood out, not just politically, but personally: Mark Antony. He was not unknown to her. During Caesar's time in Egypt, Antony had briefly visited and had heard of the formidable queen. Years later, her reputation had only grown, as had his. Antony was a man of fire, a fearless general, admired for his bravery on the battlefield and his ability to command loyalty. But he was also indulgent, known for revelry, charm, and grand ambition. He was in many ways Cleopatra's mirror. Their first official meeting was arranged in the city of Tarsus, where Antony summoned Cleopatra to explain her role in recent Roman affairs. But Cleopatra was no emissary to be questioned. She arrived not to beg for a favor, but to mesmerize. She sailed up the Cydnus River aboard a barge, unlike anything the Roman soldiers had ever seen. Its sails were purple, perfumed with rare incense. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, attended by servants dressed as cupids and nymphs. The very air shimmered with scent and music. When Antony laid eyes on her, time seemed to stall. Cleopatra had not only captured his gaze, she had seized his imagination. And when she spoke, it became clear her allure was not just physical, but intellectual. She challenged him, teased him, and spoke of philosophy, empire, and the games of power with the fluency of a Roman senator. Antony was captivated. Cleopatra had done more than impress him. She had intrigued and disarmed. He accepted her invitation to return with her to Egypt, where their connection deepened, not just in affection, but in ambition. In Alexandria, they reveled in a world of opulence and excess. Be stretched into dawn, where golden goblets overflowed and poets recited verses by torchlight. But beneath the splendor, serious plans were being forged. Cleopatra saw in Antony a chance to protect Egypt's independence, to rise beyond survival and into greatness. Antony, too, saw the possibilities. With Cleopatra's wealth and ships, he could challenge Octavian and carve his own destiny. Their relationship quickly blossomed into more than an alliance. That became lovers and partners, ruling Egypt in a harmony rare even in myth. Antony embraced Egyptian culture and rituals. Cleopatra, for her part, supported his military ambitions. Together they had 3 children, twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. But their union was not merely personal, it was profoundly political. Antony's involvement with Cleopatra sent shockwaves through Rome. His enemies, especially Octavian, portrayed him as a man seduced and manipulated by an exotic queen who sought to corrupt Roman virtue. The propaganda was vicious. Coins were minted showing Antony in Eastern dress. Speeches denounced him as a traitor to Roman values. To make matters worse, Antony was married not just to any woman, but to Octavian's sister, Octavia. His decision to leave her for Cleopatra only widened the rift between the 2 men. What began as a rivalry turned into enmity, and enmity into war. Cleopatra, meanwhile, prepared. She was not naive. She knew Rome would come. She expanded her fleet, fortified her borders, and worked tirelessly to present her children as rightful heirs to a new world order, one that might stretch from the Tigris to the Nile. In an extraordinary ceremony, Antony publicly declared Caesarion as the legitimate son of Julius Caesar and King of Kings. Cleopatra was crowned Queen of Kings, and their children were assigned Eastern territories to rule. It was a message not just to Egypt, but to Rome. A new dynasty was rising, and it did not require the Senate's permission. Octavian reacted with fury. He declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a brilliant political move. By focusing Rome's wrath on the foreign queen rather than the Roman general, he stirred national pride and rallied support. To the Roman people, Cleopatra was now the face of the enemy. And so the lovers who had built an empire of gold and dreams prepared to defend it. But clouds gathered fast. And what awaited them was not triumph, but a reckoning that would echo through history. Chapter 5, The End of an Empire, The Fall of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The sky over the Mediterranean darkened as war drums beat from the heart of Rome. What had begun as whispers and accusations soon became declarations and fleets. Rome would not tolerate the rise of a new Eastern dynasty. And Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, now stood at the center of its crosshairs. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and now the unrivaled power in Rome, launched a final campaign to destroy the alliance of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. He cast them as traitors, lovers, lost in luxury, who dared to challenge the order of the Roman world. His propaganda machine worked tirelessly, shaping public opinion until the very idea of Cleopatra became synonymous with seduction, deceit, and rebellion. But the truth was more complex. In Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony prepared for war. Their bond, once forged in pleasure, had matured into something steel-hard. They no longer danced in golden halls. They stood side by side at war councils, balancing strategy with urgency. Their fate and that of their children rested on what they could salvage from the storm bearing down on them. The decisive confrontation came at sea off the coast of Greece in a place called Actium. Antony and Cleopatra brought their combined fleets, massive, majestic warships manned by thousands. Their forces were formidable, but Octavian's navy was disciplined, better supplied, and commanded with cold precision. On the day of battle, the waters churned with oars and arrows. Cleopatra commanded her own fleet, her ships towering like floating fortresses. But as the tide of battle shifted, a sudden movement altered the course of history. Cleopatra's ships turned and withdrew. To this day, historians debate her motive. Was it strategic retreat or desperation? Was it a planned signal to regroup or a reaction to an unfolding disaster? From that point forward, regardless of intent, the sight of Cleopatra fleeing devastated Antony. He believed she had betrayed him, abandoned the cause, and perhaps him. In that moment of heartbreak and confusion, his command faltered. His fleet collapsed. Octavian's forces claimed victory. The lovers fled back to Egypt, pursued by vengeance. In Alexandria, the walls closed in. Antony, consumed by despair, attempted to rally his troops one final time. But morale was broken, and many defected to Octavian. Realizing the end was near, Antony made one last stand and failed. What followed was a tragedy played out with Shakespearean intensity. Believing Cleopatra had taken her own life to avoid capture, Antony fell on his sword. His injury was not instantly fatal, and when he learned she still lived, he demanded to be brought to her. His body was carried to her hidden sanctuary, a fortified chamber within the palace. There, bloodied and fading, he died in her arms. The grief was real, but Cleopatra had no time to mourn. Octavian's army was at the gates. She tried first to negotiate. Perhaps she could strike a deal for her children, for Caesarion, for Egypt itself. But she quickly saw that Octavian sought something more than victory. He wanted spectacle. He wanted to parade her through the streets of Rome in chains, a trophy of conquest, a queen reduced to humiliation that Cleopatra would never allow. She retreated to her royal chamber one last time, dressed in her finest robes crowned with gold. She surrounded herself with relics of her reign, as if building her own funeral temple. Legend holds that she arranged for a small basket to be brought to her, one that concealed an asp, a venomous snake sacred to Egyptian mythology. With calm defiance, Cleopatra allowed the snake to bite her. Death came quickly. When Octavian entered her quarters, he found not a prisoner, but a queen who had claimed the right to die on her own terms. Her lifeless body lay draped in regal garments as if she had simply stepped from history into myth. In the days that followed, Caesarion was executed, despite his royal blood. Cleopatra's children with Antony were taken to Rome to be raised under imperial watch. Egypt, for the first time in over 3,000 years, ceased to be ruled by a native or independent monarch. It became a Roman province, its treasures funneled to the empire, its sovereignty a memory. But Cleopatra's story did not vanish. She became a legend. Some reviled her as a temptress who brought down great men. Others revered her as a symbol of feminine power, unmatched intellect, and unshakable will. Her life, though marked by sorrow, stands as a testament to what it means to defy expectations, to rule not through birthright alone, but through brilliance and audacity. Her story echoes through the ages, not because she was perfect, but because she dared to be more than what her world allowed. She dared to lead, to love, to lose, and to choose her own end. And in doing so, she became immortal.